Most people understand inheritance tax, and most people understand income tax. What many people haven't realised yet is that after April 2027, some inherited pensions could potentially face both. First, inheritance tax as part of the estate, then later, income tax when beneficiaries actually draw the money. Two completely separate tax systems affecting the same pension pot. Now, that does not mean everybody suddenly loses 60 or 70% of their pension, but it does mean the numbers can look very different to what many families were expecting. And for some people, the pension they deliberately preserve for their family could become far less efficient than they realised. Now, as a chartered financial planner, I think this is one of the biggest retirement planning changes people still aren't properly talking about. Right, let's get into it. Welcome back to Money Under the Microscope, where we make finance clear. How it works today. Right, before we get into the changes, let's quickly understand how pension death benefits work right now, because the contrast matters. Under the current rules, pensions usually sit outside the estate for inheritance tax purposes. That means when somebody dies, their pension doesn't normally get counted alongside things such as their house, savings, or investments when inheritance tax is being calculated. Instead, the pension provider or scheme trustees decide who receives the money, usually guided by the nomination forms the person completed during their lifetime. And right now, in many cases, that can be extremely tax efficient. But there's one important distinction: age 75. If somebody dies before the age of 75, their beneficiaries can usually receive pension death benefits free of income tax as well, provided certain conditions are met. So, under today's rules, no inheritance tax and usually no income tax either. But if somebody dies after the age of 75, things work differently. The pension still normally sits outside of the estate for inheritance tax under the current rules, but when beneficiaries later draw money from the inherited pension, those withdrawals are taxed as income at their own marginal rate. So the pension is usually tax-free to inherit, but potentially taxable to spend. But that's the position today anyway. And for years, that made pensions one of the most efficient assets to leave to future generations. Now, what changes in April 2027? From the 6th of April 2027, unused pension funds and certain pension death benefits are due to become part of the inheritance tax calculation for many estates. And that creates a completely different planning landscape. Because now, for somebody who dies after the age of 75, with a pension still largely untouched, there can potentially be two separate layers of tax affecting the same pot of money. First, inheritance tax. If the combined value of the estate, including the pension, exceeds the available inheritance tax allowances, inheritance tax may apply at 40% on the excess. Then second, income tax. Because the existing income tax rules on inherited pensions after the age of 75 don't disappear. So when beneficiaries later access the inherited pension money, withdrawals can still be taxable as income at their own marginal rate. Now, this is important. That does not automatically mean somebody loses 60 or 70% of their pension. The actual outcome depends on the size of the estate, available allowances, who inherits the pension, their own tax position, and how quickly the money is withdrawn. But what it does mean is that a strategy which used to be extremely tax efficient may no longer work the same way after April 2027. So let's look at two specific examples. Meet David. David is 78, divorced, owns his home outright worth £320,000, has £40,000 in savings, and has a pension in drawdown worth £180,000. He's barely touched the pension because he's always believed it was the best asset to leave to his two adult children. Under today's rules, that pension normally sits outside his estate for inheritance tax purposes. So when the inheritance tax is calculated, the focus is mainly on the house and the savings, roughly £360,000. Depending on the allowances available, he may pay little or no inheritance tax, and separately his children inherit the pension. But after April 2027, the pension is expected to form part of the inheritance tax calculation as well. Now, the estate being assessed is no longer £360,000, it's closer to £540,000. And although the exact tax outcome depends on the available allowances and who inherits the property, the pension has now potentially created an inheritance tax issue where they may previously have had little or none. Then later, when the children draw the money from the inherited pension, those withdrawals may still be subject to income tax at their own marginal rates. And David doesn't consider himself wealthy. He owns a fairly average house, he has a reasonable pension, and he followed what was widely considered sensible planning at the time. But the rules changed around him. Example 2. The larger estate. Now let's meet Margaret. Margaret is 82. Her home is worth around £650,000. She has ISAs and savings worth roughly £200,000. And she has a pension worth around £450,000 that she deliberately left largely untouched. Because under the old rules, it was often one of the most tax-efficient assets to pass on. Under today's system, her taxable estate is roughly £850,000 because the pension normally sits outside the inheritance tax calculation. But after April 2027, the pension becomes part of the picture. Now the estate being assessed is closer to 1.3 million, which significantly changes the inheritance tax exposure. And then, when beneficiaries eventually access the inherited pension, there may still be income tax to pay on withdrawals depending on their own tax position. Margaret had a plan, and to be fair, it was a sensible plan under the old rules. That's the point. For years, people were encouraged to preserve pension wealth where possible because of how efficiently it could pass between generations. The problem is the rules changed after many of those plans were already in motion. Now, why this catches people out? Now, what makes this quite uncomfortable is that people most exposed to these changes are often the people who planned most carefully. The sort of people who reviewed their pensions, managed withdrawals carefully, preserved pension wealth deliberately, and structured retirement around the rules that existed at the time. For years, the logic was straightforward. Spend other assets first, leave the pension invested, pass it on later. And under the old rules, that often made perfect sense. The issue is that pension planning happens over decades. People make decisions in their 50s and 60s that are designed to play out in their 70s, 80s and beyond. And they don't expect the rules to change halfway through the strategy. But now they have. And in some cases, the reward for having planned carefully under the old rules is ending up with a pension pot large enough to create a problem under the new ones. That's why understanding this now matters. Not in 2028 when the person has already died. Now, while there's still time to review the position properly. So, what are people actually doing about this? Well, this isn't a video about specific solutions, because proper financial planning depends entirely on somebody's personal situation. But broadly speaking, people are starting to review things like how much they leave inside pensions, which assets they draw from first in retirement, whether gifting strategies now make more sense, and whether their nominations and estate paperwork are properly organised. And some people are deciding to use pension money more actively during their lifetime rather than preserving large untouched pots indefinitely. Others are reassessing the balance between pensions, ISAs, cash, and gifting strategies. And for many people, the first step is simply understanding that the rules have changed, because most people still think pensions will automatically sit outside of their estate for inheritance tax purposes. But after April 2027, for many estates, that assumption could prove to be quite costly. Okay, let's recap. From April 2027, the way pensions are treated on death is changing significantly. For some families, especially where somebody dies after 75 with large unused pension funds, the combination of inheritance tax and income tax can materially reduce what future generations eventually receive. Not everybody will be affected equally. The outcome depends on estate size, available allowances, beneficiary circumstances, and how inherited pensions are actually used. But this absolutely is not just a problem for the ultra-wealthy anymore, which is why understanding the rules matter now while people still have time to review their planning properly. In the next video, we're going to be looking at gifting, specifically giving money to your children before you die, the mistakes people make, and how gifting fits into the bigger picture after 2027. If you found this video useful, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. This is Money Under the Microscope, where we make finance clear.